Hey, so welcome everyone to Psychiatry Grand Rounds. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce somebody who I have known and collaborated with for many years now. It's with a lot of pride that I say that because he's such an internationally known and respected expert in collective recovery from trauma, which is sadly something that with every passing day becomes more and more relevant to all of us. With everything that we're reading about now in the news. This is quite a moment to have Dr. Jack Saul, who's a psychologist and artist. He's the founding director of the International Trauma Studies Program. He's which is a research and training institute based in New York City. And he served on the faculties of New York University School of Medicine, the New School for Social Research, Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. As a psychologist and family therapist, he's created a number of programs in New York City and internationally for populations that have endured disaster, war, torture, and political violence. And all of this is documented in his book, Collective Trauma, Collective Healing, published by Routledge in 2022. And he's currently working on the public arts and conversation project entitled Moral Injuries of War. So my goodness, how timely this is. And that project is about the need to have a national public reckoning in the United States on war making and war culture. So I also want to provide a couple of personal details that I have known Jack Saul since I was introduced to him through New York City-based networks that initially were involved in 9/11 response. So Jack Saul was quite a leader in providing a collective, community-based, holistic approach to recovery from 9/11 that was adapted from work that he had done in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia in many different war zones over the prior decades. And the networks that he helped to build in the wake of 9/11 persist to this day. He's also one of the founders of Bellevue Hospital's Survivors of Torture program in New York City, which is a program that I worked with in my decades there in the psychiatry department. It's internationally renowned for its approach. There are just so many accomplishments that I could run on and on about. And I'll end with, for fun, what ChatGPT said about Jack Saul, that he has made these key contributions to collective trauma, including one, defining collective trauma itself, the whole concept of collective trauma in our field of mental health, which is quite individually focused. So he has been instrumental in defining and conceptualizing collective trauma as it refers to the psychological and emotional impact of traumatic events experienced by groups or communities rather than individual trauma. And this could include shared experience of loss, fear, distress, that affects the collective identity and well-being of an affected community. Two, he's contributed to understanding resilience and coping. So his work emphasizes understanding coping mechanisms and resilience of individuals and communities facing collective trauma and the potential for post-traumatic growth in the aftermath of these kinds of events, which lends us to the last point of community healing and recovery. He's an advocate for community-based approaches to healing and recovery. And he emphasizes the significance of collective ritual storytelling and community support in the healing process. Boy, what ChatGPT can glean. So it's my honor to introduce Jack Saul. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena. Thank you for inviting me here. And thank you for being one of my greatest advocates in this kind of work. I am going to present a couple of case examples on what we call communalization of healing, or a collective approach to addressing trauma. And I do want to present first kind of an overview of what we did after 9/11, because that was a very thorough community resilience project. And I think it will clarify some of the key concepts in this approach. And then I will, on the second, I'll present this new project that we're working on the moral injuries of war, which has to do with U.S. response to 9/11 and the issues of moral injury in response to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I live in the neighborhood in Manhattan that was just blocks away from the World Trade Center, and witnessed with my family and neighbors the attacks on September 11th, 2001. My children, ages 8 and 5 at the time, went to the school 2 blocks north of the World Trade Center, and they, along with 600 children in their school, saw people falling and jumping to their deaths from the towers and had to evacuate the school. We ran north together, taking side streets to avoid the debris storms created by the falling towers. The communities that we're concerned with here, in which we were working, are those located on the west side of Lower Manhattan, just next to the World Trade Center. These were the children, teachers, parents, residents, and workers who experienced the greatest physical exposure to the events of 9/11, including witnessing the planes crashing into the towers, the buildings burning and collapsing, people jumping and falling to their deaths, the disappearance and deaths of family and friends, the direct threat to life and harm from debris storms, emergency evacuations from workplace and schools, and displacement from home, school, business, and environmental contamination. We met as a community in Lower Manhattan following 9/11, 2001, to discuss how we could address the psychosocial challenges that we thought as a community were most important, and strengthen our capacities as families and communities to cope with the losses, the grief, the stress, and the terror that we had experienced. Over the next 3 years, I worked with fellow parents and mental health professionals from our school community to address the ongoing mental health and psychosocial needs of all members of the community and develop projects to promote community resilience. We eventually received funding from FEMA to develop the first community resilience demonstration project. At the simplest level, we define community resilience as a community's capacity, hope, and faith to withstand major trauma and loss, overcome adversity, and prevail, usually with increased resources, competence, and connectedness. Our approach to families and communities is based on the assumption that they are intrinsically healthy and competent, and in order for them to access this intrinsic competence, we need to be able to retain or regain connection to their families and natural support systems, their daily patterns and rituals, their sense of meaning, their cultural and or spiritual support systems. In times of massive trauma, these primary connections are often disrupted. Community resilience approaches are systemically focused and address multiple levels and themes in the process of recovery. A shortcoming of many trauma disaster response programs is that they address trauma primarily at the level of the individual while ignoring the larger context. The disruptions that affect family systems, work organizations, and communal structures are often the most psychosocially debilitating because they may lead to community fragmentation, conflict, and destabilization. People have many unexpected competencies and resources that may contribute to healing. Community members with a diversity of skills and ages contribute in different ways to the resilience of a community. The elderly may bring memories of coping with previous tragedies, while children may help promote a sense of vitality with their capacity for play and spontaneity. People bring a diversity of strengths and skills to the recovery process based on occupation and talents, from artistic to organizational management to technological skills, from the sublime to the mundane. Thus, recovery can be seen as a creative process arising from the synergy of various community actors coming together to work toward a common purpose. The work that I did, and the person I collaborated with was a psychiatrist, Judith Landau, who developed the LINK model of community resilience. And it's based on the following principles. It seeks to engage the entire system of the community, including representation of individuals and subsystems from each cultural and ethnic group, all economic, cultural, and status strata. It identifies and builds on existing resources. It utilizes these resources to address ongoing challenges, turn goals into realistic tasks, and those into practical projects. It encourages community links, or natural change agents, members of the community, to become leaders in their community to promote well-being. And they become the drivers of the community resilience process. And the success of the project belongs to the community itself. As a provider, we work with people from within the community to take leadership on the implementation of the psychosocial process. In this case, in that I was a professional and a resident of the community, I was both an inside and outside kind of, had an inside and outside relationship. So many of the other community members were also mental health professionals and working to address the psychosocial challenges. In Lower Manhattan, most of the initial funding was provided to screen children for mental health difficulties and refer symptomatic children for therapy. Yet the idea of educating parents and teachers on how to recognize and better respond to children's difficulties was rarely considered. Privileging the expertise of professionals can undermine the confidence and resourcefulness of both teachers and parents. So the beginning in the week following 9/11, parents, teachers, school psychologists, and staff established family support groups that made connections across school communities. There were something like 6 elementary schools in Lower Manhattan and a high school. And this allowed for the sharing of ideas about how to address the emotional issues of both children and adults. These support groups later developed into a series of community forums, expanding the notion of healing beyond a primary focus on individual stress reactions to a broader notion of community-wide response and recovery. In this context, the many varied reactions to the terrorist attacks could be normalized and a framework presented of the stages through which a community might pass following a disaster. So we described this first stage as the United We Stand stage, the initial stage of shock and then coming together, sharing, letting one's guard down. It's like in this stage, there's kind of a hormonal response in which people are feeling much more oxytocin, and they kind of are primed to be bonding with each other. And people remarked that in New York City, they never saw people as nice to each other as during that stage. The second stage we described as molasses and minefields. In the weeks following 9/11, people started to get tired and irritable. Stresses accumulate, tempers flare, people retreat into the groups where they feel safer. During this stage, it was important to demonstrate that there were practical ways to reduce stress and tensions in the community. And we wanted to make people clear to people that one of the risk factors for difficulties is when a community fragments and goes into conflict, because it reduces the resilience of the community when that happens. A positive vision of recovery, the third stage in which the community comes together to build hope for the future, gaining an understanding that recovery is not a passive process, but a consequence of actively coming together for a common purpose. In January 2002, with the plan to return the children to their home schools by the end of the month. This is 4 months later. Many parents were feeling distressed about going back for the first time to the place where 4 months earlier they had experienced the horrors of 9/11. The community forum at that time focused on supporting parents and teachers, presenting stress reduction skills, and carrying out a needs assessment. During the meeting, a group of over 100 parents broke up into small groups according to the age level of their children to discuss their concerns and ways to increase their skills as parents and teachers to best help their children. This included a collective conversation about how parents and teachers could take care of themselves and support each other as well. During this process, we noticed that there was a subtle modulation at a collective level when people behaved in a markedly distressed manner, appearing to be overestimating present and future danger. They received constructive feedback, helping them to become more realistic in their assessment of threat. Similarly, when people became overly irritable, they could be reminded of the need to modulate their reactions. In this way, the connectedness of the community provided a matrix of healing and support, along with sound reality testing. A community needs assessment was conducted with the participants in the community forums, and the community's priorities were articulated. They fell into 4 major categories. The community wanted to continue to monitor environmental safety and respond to the risks that may arise. Our community was very aware of the environmental pollution due to the burning of the buildings, which was still going on at the time, and the dust that had spread over the whole neighborhood. And they hired their own environmental monitors to come in and monitor what was going on, because we actually did not trust as a community the government's environmental kind of monitoring. And we were right to do that, because they actually were giving us the wrong information later and telling people to go back to places that were actually environmentally harmful. We also, as a community, wanted to monitor and respond to the emotional needs and reactions in children and adults, and to promote social cohesion. One of the goals was to establish a public space for activities, discussion, and recreation, and provide clear and useful information on emotional reactions and recovery skills. Following the community forum, rather than having therapists from outside the school community evaluating and working with children, school psychologists who had been working in schools and who were familiar with the parents and children ran weekly discussion and support groups for parents of children at different age levels. And special ed teachers ran art groups where children could express their ongoing feelings and concerns. Of course, they could also identify through the parent groups and the child art groups which kids may have needed referral to ongoing therapy. These groups ran consistently for over 2 years. The outcome of the forums was that the community came together to create a downtown community resource center, which promoted community-initiated recovery activities over the next 3 years. And this was, we decided as a community that most of the funding was going to all the clinics around the community, but had very little access to people within the community, that we should actually, as a community, apply for mental health funding. And we were able to put together a grant and get that funding to develop this downtown community resource center. And this center consisted of a small staff that supported the efforts of the community by providing space, stipends, administrative support, technical assistance, and funding development for these community-initiated activities. And most of the activities were voluntary. So what I want to do is just show a couple of so a number of the projects were developed by community members, including parental support groups, peer support programs for different occupational groups, and two narrative projects. This first one here involved members of the community getting training in oral history techniques, and then having a videographer from the community videoing these histories, and then editing them and putting them up on the website. And the narrative that they were trying to collect were people's experience within the community, their history of living there in the community, how the community had come together, and then how the attacks had affected the community going on. Another project was a theater witness project. We'd had experience doing these kind of theater projects before with refugee communities, where we basically put together an ensemble of actors, and they would meet with community members who would give testimonies to the actors, and the actors would work with them collaboratively to turn these testimonies into theatrical scenes, and then weave these scenes into a full-length performance that was played in 2003 at a theater downtown, and became a catalyst for ongoing community conversation. So we found that community resilience in this particular New York context following the terrorist attacks of 9/11 encompass four major themes. First, building community and enhancing social connectedness as a foundation for recovery. Community recovery begins with the reweaving of social connections that have been disrupted by traumatic events. And we emphasize the reestablishment of old community connections while facilitating new ones. This includes strengthening the system of social support, coalition building, and information and resource sharing. Second, reestablishing the rhythms and routines of life and engaging in collective healing rituals. We know this from global mental health approaches to disaster, that one of the first things you want to do is get kids out there into, soccer leagues, start to bring back the usual rhythms of life, and this reduces the unpredictability and chaos that people may feel after a disaster. So there were a number of spontaneous neighborhood vigils, anniversary rituals, community events marking seasonal changes and holidays, and these became important for communities to reconnect with long-established temporal rhythms and to process the dissonant feelings associated with the events of massive trauma. Many examples of this emerged following the traumatic events of September 11. For example, there was a network called New York City Recovers of over 1,000 community organizations that work together on sharing ideas and strengthening the mesosystem, this intermediate level in a city that mediates between people on the ground and policymakers and funders. And these community organizations really provide the kind of communication between what's happening on the ground and what decision-making is being made. Third, collectively telling the story of the community's experience and response. An important part of the communal healing process is having one's story validated and becoming a part of the collective story that emerges after a tragedy. As we saw in New York City following September 11th, the emerging story after such events needs to be broad enough to encompass the many varying experiences people had. It can be problematic when the dominant narrative is narrow, rigid, or marginalizes segments of the population. A glaring example of this was the case for Arab-speaking and Muslim communities, where many members, not only in New York, but also throughout the United States, faced harassment, detention, and deportation purely as a result of their group identification. Invariably, it is those people who do not have a voice, whose story is excluded, that will be further victimized or exploited after a collective tragedy. And fourth, arriving at a positive vision of the future with renewed hope. Many of the responses that we saw after 9/11 were attempts to reestablish hope for the future. One of the most important questions faced by communities after a catastrophe is, how do we move from the haunting memories of the tragedy to a vision of the future that incorporates the new realities that we're facing? And the process by which a community develops a positive vision of its future is an important step in its recovery. So I want to talk now about this project on the moral injuries of war. This has been in response to the global wars on terror, which were a response to 9/11. And I want to present this connected to 9/11 because I spent after working on this project after 9/11, as a clinician, I saw war reporters and photographers for the next 20 years who were covering the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And over time, I realized, as I was doing this therapeutic work, that many of the journalists were struggling with not only traumatic stress reactions, but also a kind of moral anguish in their response to what they'd seen and experienced. Some were dogged by this intense guilt for being able to leave the war zone while their local colleagues had no such choice. Others were burdened by survival guilt after having lost fellow journalists or soldiers they'd come to know and care about. Still others felt unable to report the real extent of the war's devastation, only the spruced up versions that the military deemed acceptable for consumption by the American public. As one photographer bitterly put it, I felt I was doing public relations for the military. So since 2001, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties and cost trillions of dollars. In such insurgency wars, the line between combatant and non-combatant is often blurred and inevitably leads to countless atrocities. Many veterans, war correspondents, and other witnesses of war are troubled by their experiences and may suffer from moral injury, the sense that one's fundamental understanding of right and wrong has been violated. And I would say that since doing this work and including refugees in our projects, they, as well as the citizens in those countries where the wars were being fought, also not only suffer from traumatic stress reactions, they suffer from moral injuries themselves. So what plagues them is not a set of symptoms, but a crisis of conscience. They often cannot recognize the kind of person they have become, given the acts they've committed or witnessed in war. I began to look at the literature on moral injury that was written about veterans and soldiers. Moral injury is a term originally coined by the naval psychiatrist Jonathan Shea during the war in Vietnam. Shea defines moral injury as engaging in, perpetrating, witnessing, or learning about acts that transgress one's moral beliefs and expectations, or as betrayal by an authority figure in a high-stakes situation. Much of the research on moral injury has focused on delineating it from PTSD. In contrast to traumatic stress symptoms of re-experiencing avoidance and arousal, moral injury's main features are shame and guilt, anger, anhedonia, and social isolation, social alienation. The particular experience that one may have had in the war may be associated with different expressions. Those experiencing betrayal are often, what they express is often associated with anger. Perpetration is usually related to guilt and or shame. Depressive symptoms may be associated with involvement in civilian deaths, and many people will externalize and engage in substance abuse, suicidality, and aggression toward others. The research shows that individuals exposed to potentially morally injurious events called PMIEs are at greater risk of developing psychiatric symptoms, including suicidal ideation. Moral injury is now recognized by the U.S. Veterans Administration as a major contributor to the high rate of suicides in U.S. veterans, which is currently between 17 and 25 a day, more than the number of U.S. soldiers who died over the past 20 years in combat. I've been particularly interested in the social factors that may be associated with either exacerbating or ameliorating moral injury. And first of all, one of the social factors is the inevitable dehumanization of enemy combatants, which is almost a necessary part of going to war. Unfortunately, this process of othering may also be generalized to the civilian population as well. Risk factors for moral injury are lack of social support, rejection by family and friends, and loss of trust in the military, government, or society in general. Protective factors helping people deal with moral injuries are strong social bonds, the quality of one's relationships, and community involvement. The experience of killing has often been associated with an alienation from other civilians, as well as marital problems. This feeling that no one else can understand what it means to kill, as well as not being able or choosing not to communicate about it and not feeling worthy of love, may lead to the emotional disconnection from others and a disruption of communication. So there have been a variety of approaches to treating moral injury. The usual PTSD approaches of prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy have been found to have limited success. Exposure therapy may even be harmful for those suffering from moral injury. And other approaches that have been found helpful are acceptance and commitment therapy and adaptive disclosure, because they may open up possibilities for self-compassion, self-forgiveness, and ways of making amends. And the approach building spiritual strength is a group intervention that has had some of the best therapeutic outcomes. But as I reviewed the research and attended conferences on moral injury, I found myself increasingly uncomfortable with the prevailing view that this ethical distress was being located entirely within the individual and should be treated as such. Instead, I began to see moral injury as a disruption of relationship, a wound that a person inflicts or feels they've inflicted on other people. Or it may be the feeling of betrayed by others. And I began to see that the moral healing required not only individual work, but also a particular experience of community. As therapists well know, everyone needs a safe space to speak their truth to others, people who can listen and understand with genuine empathy. being heard and having one's experience acknowledged by a community can be extremely reparative, helping to legitimize a person's experience and replace the darkness of self-blame and isolation with the light of forgiveness and connectedness. Having done a lot of work on using testimony in work with refugee populations, I found that got very interested in how we might use this to address moral injury as well. And as I was starting to do this project, I met colleagues at the Philadelphia VA hospital, Chaplain Chris Antal and psychologist Peter Yeoman, who were running a moral injury program, which featured 12-week discussion groups in which veterans shared with each other their experiences of moral injury and helped to clarify and recover their basic moral values. Afterward, a communal healing ritual took place at the hospital's chapel, wherein each participant stood at the pulpit and shared their definitions and experiences of moral injury with an interested public. As a member of that audience, I found myself horrified by what these men had endured, but also impressed by their courage to come forth and speak despite a deep sense of shame. Once all the veterans had spoken, we, the civilian audience members, were invited up to the pulpit, where we walked in a circle around the men, looking deeply into each other's eyes and placing our hands on their shoulders. This communal ritual sparked something in me, a kind of genuine connection with these men, and through that, a jolt of solidarity. I felt my own part in their suffering. It evoked for me the many times I'd seen similar pain in the war correspondents I treated in therapy, and my own sense of helplessness about addressing the US policies that had produced the atrocities of war. The more convinced I became of the healing power of sharing moral injury, accompanied by genuine listening and acknowledging, the more I was drawn to creating communal spaces in which this essential process could unfold. So in 2018, I decided to create a project on moral injury to address this radical disconnectedness they felt. This project started off as a research and public art installation called Moral Injuries of War. The research that we were doing focused on qualitative study of the way military veterans and war correspondents spoke about morally challenging experiences they had during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, how they coped with these experiences, and what they would like others, particularly the public, to know about their personal experiences during these wars and about war in general. After doing a series of interviews, we then put together an immersive audio installation based on the material collected. Together with the team of researchers and people engaged in the arts, sound design and oral history, we designed this installation in which veterans and war correspondents shared their experiences with members of the public. I'm going to play a short clip. Well, I'm going to ask whether we can play that Vimeo piece and share it with the group.
I joined the military November 2001. I got a phone call to turn on the TV to see one of the towers on fire. And then as I'm watching, and that's when the second plane hit. And I was like, what's going on? I felt I needed to do something for my country, so became very motivated to join the military.
There's 3 rules that you need to follow in order to survive in the military. The first thing you need to do is you need to do what you're told. The second thing you need to do is you need to do what you're told. And the third, the most important thing out of all of these that you need to do what you're told. The military just teaches you don't ask questions, and if you figure it out, it's really none of your business anyway. That part. That probably is the biggest thing, is having to do things that you wonder about, but you can't ask a question.
I saw like a different side of me coming out. You know, we were handing out toys and balls and stuff like that to the kids and candy and stuff. Yeah, I heard somebody yell grenade and then blew up, and like body parts are like falling on to my Humvee, and I see this kid and I'm like, you know, what God would let a 5-year-old throw a grenade at a convoy, and out of reaction, out of rage, out of fear, out of, you know, I had to take the kid out. He was my niece's age. He was probably like 6 at the time. I just have this mindset of like, it's either me or him. And, you know, that's survival. That's how it has to be. You know, there's no way in hell that I'm going home in a body bag. My mentality was, I'm not going home in a body bag. I'm going to make sure you will, though.
No matter what now, I always think that there's room for diplomacy. I think that war altogether is absolutely unnecessary. So I've just become more cynical about all the conflict around the world. The cynical part of me wants the public to understand that it's your fault. We are all complicit in all of this horror. I don't need other people to experience my pain. I need other people to understand that they are complicit in my pain. I can hold my pain myself, but other people need to understand that they had a part in causing it.
So one way of looking at moral injury is Chaplain Untal's definition of it as the unequal distribution of appropriate moral pain. In many ways, the veteran suffering from moral injury has shouldered the burden of shame and guilt that we all could be experiencing about these wars fought in our name. Because of this unequal distribution of pain, there's also the unequal distribution of appropriate moral accountability. And this sharing of responsibility by the veteran with the public can be one of the antidotes to moral injury. And it's often the avenue toward their reintegration into society, and they're participating with the public in a kind of process of acknowledgement, shared accountability, and a reparative process. And I've come to believe that we need to look at collective moral injury, or the distress that many of us feel as in our society about the larger social and political factors that compel people to commit moral violations in the first place, or put people in situations where they have to make moral compromises. And we've seen this expressed by healthcare workers during the pandemic, and then other groups like police and first responders. For ordinary citizens, this requires a difficult personal reckoning. Each of us, I believe, bears some responsibility for the suffering of those pushed to commit ethical injuries in the name of their government, be it in the form of military priorities or social policies. those struggling with moral distress need to know that the rest of us truly hear what they've endured and recognize that we've helped to create and maintain a society that forces many of its citizens to perpetuate or witness immoral behavior. I think when we acknowledge our part in creating another human being's moral distress, it can not only help heal the individual, but also, we hope, spark collective action to address the larger social problems. So what I showed you was one of the first expressions of this moral injury of war project, which was at a Arts and Ideas Festival, and people went through and sat down, kind of 10 to 15 people at a time, listened, and then they gave responses afterwards, either written or recorded responses, then were brought back to the veterans and journalists who participated in the audio installation. And I think what happens is when people were listening to these stories of moral injury, they're more likely to identify with the soldiers, because anyone can be in a situation where they would have these kind of moral dilemmas. They're different from the stories of PTSD that involve more life-threatening situations. Since then, we've been presenting this project across the US to audiences of veterans, refugees, immigrants, and ordinary citizens. Most recently, and I want to show you some pictures from this recent event. So, how did I even mute? So recently we presented this moral injuries of war in a theater in Brooklyn, National Sawdust Space, and it included about 140 people each night. And they listened to the audio installation, as well as veterans who attended in person and engaged in a facilitated public conversation about their war experiences. And the public could respond to what resonated for them. Most of the public did not even know a veteran, or knew very little about the experiences of war from veterans. So we did a lot of work to prepare people to listen compassionately to the voices of the veterans. Oh, there you go. And to be grounded as they were listening, and connected people so that they wouldn't be listening alone. So we had people breaking out into small group discussions, and then a larger conversation with the whole group. And we had a number of people there were a number of themes that emerged each night in the audience that in response to what the veterans brought to the group. Following this communal discussion, we had an embodied exploration into actions the public may take in response to what they heard, what they wanted to take with them, and what they could possibly do in response to what they heard that evening. Whether it was learning more about moral injury among veterans, getting to know veterans beyond the kind of I thank you for your service kind of proclamation, or to engage in some kind of work to learn more about war in our society. So to date, there have been over 3,000 people who participated in these presentations, and we're looking to take it to other venues. But I'd like to end with a quotation from the Vietnamese Buddhist monk who said that veterans are the light at the tip of the candle, illuminating the way for the whole nation. If veterans can achieve awareness, transformation, understanding, and peace, they can share with the rest of society the realities of war. and they can teach us how to make peace with ourselves and each other, so we never have to use violence to resolve conflicts again. So thank you. I hope we have some time to have some discussion.
Thank you so much for that brilliant talk. You have made huge contributions to mental health. First, redefining trauma, not as from an individual phenomenon to a group phenomenon, and recovery from an individual to a group phenomenon, but now helping us to reorient from trauma to moral injury. Thank you so much for that. And because time is short, I'm going to lump the first three questions together, and we'll see if we can get further than that. The first question touches on the role of social media. You know, that may be something that's evolved quite a bit since the 9/11 project that you described. What's the role of social media in collective recovery? Then a question about socioeconomic status, since Tribeca in New York City is a very different place than the Eastern European, Southeast Asian, and Sub-Saharan African communities where you've worked. And then lastly, there was a question about comment on what's happening in the Middle East right at this moment, if you get to that. I know that's huge.
Well, first of all, these approaches, these collective approaches, we basically learn them in places like Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, because they're collectivist cultures. And when we do work in global mental health and psychosocial support, we better be working with these collective approaches, because that's what's most natural to them. So after 9/11, we brought people who had been working in these collective contexts to New York to teach us how to do this work. It actually is more difficult to do it in our society because we're so oriented to treating people as individuals. So they work well in other societies, if that's the question that you were asking. I forgot the first question, but
It was on social media, the role of social media in collective recovery.
well, social media we can use now. There's so many groups and interventions now that can be used with bringing communities together. It's not the same as being in person, but there's a lot of that going on, as well as communities getting consultation from outsiders on how to engage in a process of recovery and not just feel alone in doing this themselves. So through social media, and we've seen this in work with communities in Ukraine, this can be extremely important tool. And then in terms of the Middle East, I mean, this just having gone through 9/11 and seeing that this is kind of a 9/11 event for Israel, and it raises all kinds of complexities about the situation there in the Middle East and the traumatization that's going on both sides, and this violence that we just can't get a handle on. My main kind of take as a systems-oriented family therapist is that when you have a family and you have siblings fighting in a family, you're not going to get them to find a way of making up when the parents are often involved in that struggle and need to be the ones who are helping the kids find a way out of a conflict. And I would apply that metaphor here too. This conflict is shaped by the surrounding countries, and it's an international issue, and it needs to be addressed as a collective process, as a collaborative process. Maybe that's impossible, but I don't see how, without the participation of other countries, this conflict can be stopped. And it also hurts me that we're seeing there the possibility that there could be a response on the part of Israel that looks a lot like this catastrophic response that the United States made after 9/11, which became much greater catastrophe than 9/11 itself, and one of the greatest catastrophes in American history, with all the hundreds of thousands of deaths in the Middle East and the way in which this basically has hurt us as a society. Our response to it has been catastrophic. So I feel for that situation and hope that a catastrophic response can be stopped as soon as possible.
Thank you for those wise and sobering words. Thanks again.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to see you
Of
again.
course. You too.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.